Uh, Today's date is August 16th, 2016. I am in the home of Ron Whitlock. Today I'm speaking with his friend and veteran friend, Gary Wombles, as part of the Stories of Service and Ford Oval of Honor programs for WIPB TV. Mr. Wombles, thank you for being here. Could you tell us when and where you were born?
I was born April 29th, 1949, right here in Indianapolis, St. Francis Hospital. And I've lived here basically all my life.
When you were 18 years old and you got your draft notice, you opted to volunteer and join the service. What prompted you to do that?
Well, I had made up my mind in my senior year that I wanted to join the Marine Corps, and I wanted to go to Vietnam. That was the John Wayne syndrome, I guess, at the time. I don't know. And I didn't actually get a draft notice until I was in boot camp. It was kind of unique. They call you up at boot camp to give you your letters one at a time, and they made me open it because they could see it was from the government. And so I actually got my draft notice then. But I knew I was going to get one because at that point they had the lottery, and that's one of the only lotteries I've ever won in my life. I think I was number 12 or something, and my birth date was, so it was a foregone conclusion I was going to go. But I had already made up my mind.
You knew about Vietnam, what was going on in Vietnam. Did you feel it was your patriotic duty?
I did feel like it was my patriotic duty. My father was a Marine Corps veteran of World War II, and he had a brother that was in the Army in World War II, and my mom's brother was in the Army in World War II. So our family had a pretty traditional patriotic outlook on things, and I really felt like it was my duty to go. But honestly, as an 18-year-old, I wanted, it seemed adventurous, or it's like I said, you watch all the movies, and I just wanted to experience it, I guess, is the best way to explain it. So.
How would you describe your basic training?
Basic training was probably the hardest thing that I've ever gone through in my life. I think in a lot of regards, it was harder than the Vietnam, because if you made a mistake, you were punished immediately, and you were basically, you were broken to the point that you were willing to do whatever you were told, and it was a painful experience. I felt like that I think it was 9 weeks. That was the longest 9 weeks of my life. It was, in some regards, like I said, it was worse than the Vietnam thing, because I would much rather be in a firefight than have to listen to my DI tear me down, But I mean, they did it for a purpose. It made us stronger, and it made us to follow orders, and we got the sense of units more important than individuals. So those were the things that I took out of it. But yeah, it was an unpleasant experience.
Was there a particular lesson or part of your training that came back to you in combat in Vietnam?
Yeah, and it wasn't so much boot camp, but after boot camp, we went to the ITR, the Infantry Training Regiment, and they taught us there that if you were in an ambush, or if you had taken fire, rather than dropping to the ground and hiding and then figure out where it come from, that you should turn and face the fire and move into it. And that made no sense to me whatsoever. But once you get into that situation, that's the quickest and best way of putting the enemy on guard a little bit too. If they start shooting and you start running or hitting the ground, then it kind of gives them an attitude of, we've already won this. But if you move into them, or if you immediately start returning fire, instead of trying to hide, that was the first thing that I thought of in my very first firefight. these guys were right in ITR. They were right to tell us to do that. Now there was a lot of times that we did drop to the ground, and there was a lot of times I wanted to run, but the training kicks in.
Mm-hmm. What was when you got off, the plane door opens and you experience Vietnam for the first time? What was your first impression?
When I got off the plane in Vietnam, my first impression was the smell. I can't really relate what that smell was, but it was an unnatural type smell. I mean, you could smell diesel fuel and kerosene, and you could smell fish and rice, and it was not a very clean, place. So it was. And then there was just something in the atmosphere. I don't know if it was fear. I mean, you could smell powder and gunpowder and stuff like that. So the smell is what hit me most of anything. It almost, I think I stopped as I was coming down the plane. I got off and you get a whiff of that smell, and I actually stopped and looked around and thinking, this is not the good old USA.
That's everybody's first impression, the smell.
Yeah.
We talk about. How did the veterans in your unit receive you when you joined up?
When I first joined the unit, they're happy to get you, but they want to kind of keep you at arm's length. I mean, they try to feel you out. Is this somebody that we can count on, or is this somebody that we're going to have to babysit? That type of thing. They were very informative. They were very inclusive, but it took a couple of weeks or months to where you really felt comfortable with everybody.
Did you have anyone in your squad that you immediately bonded with?
Yeah, there was a guy. He actually wasn't in my squad. He was the platoon radio operator. He was from Ohio, and he and I hit it off pretty quickly, and I'm not sure exactly why that was, because I actually joined the unit while they were in the field. Ron and I, and there was one other gentleman, and I can't even remember his name, that they flew us out by helicopter, and then our unit had sent some people down to pick us up and take us back up on this hill where they were, and Hadley was one of the guys who came down, and for some reason we kind of hit it off, and I've lost contact with him, as I have with most everybody, but he and I hit it off pretty close. I stayed close with him until the end, or until I left.
What was your military occupation or specialty?
I was an 0311, which is a grunt, or we called it a target. You were a professional target, to go around and draw fire. So.
When you joined your squad, were you given any other duties?
Immediately, I was not. I was just one of the grunts to go around. After about a month, I took over the squad radio. The gentleman who was done it, who had that duty, left to go to R&R, and so I was just going to carry it until he came back. And whenever he came back, he said, "Man, if you want it, keep it. I don't want it really back." So that was kind of the way that worked out.
Was that a burden or was it an honor?
I liked it because I felt like you knew what was going on, because I could listen. I was listening to the radio all the time. And if the platoon was getting orders, then I was the one who passed it along to my squad leader. And there were times that they would have us get all up on the company frequency, and you could listen to what was going on. So I felt like I wasn't listening to a rumor. I was listening to what was really going on. And at the same time, if you were in a firefight or something like that, and there was something going on over on the other side where you couldn't really see it, you could hear kind of what was going on. You could kind of prepare for what was coming along. So I liked it. It wasn't that heavy or cumbersome or anything like that. So I thought it was a privilege.
Do you think, and don't let me put words in your mouth, but do you think that as a young infantry soldier, getting the radio gave you a sense of control over your own fate?
That's I'd not really thought about that, but now that I look at it, yeah, I think it probably did. I felt like I had a little bit more control. I didn't, but combat is about 95% mental anyway, and I did feel like I had more control because if you had to call in artillery strikes or something like that, the squad leader or the platoon leader would give you the coordinates. You know that you would. There was always two people who kind of went over the coordinates to be sure you got them right. You didn't want to call in an artillery strike to the wrong spot. But I would relay those into the artillery people or whatever, and you felt like that you were making some sort of a contribution other than just pulling the trigger.
Yeah, some agency. There's not a lot in the military, I guess, you can control, but you had that little
Yeah,
bit.
at least at that, I felt like there was some control. Like I said, it's probably more mental than anything else, but it felt good that I was able to be in communication with people you couldn't see. That it's like there's always help out there someplace.
What was your first skirmish or combat like? Can you kind of describe what you were feeling and thinking?
The first firefight that I was in was very brief, and it all happened so fast. I didn't have a chance to be afraid or anything else. We had received some sniper fire, and we turned to the direction that the snipers were firing, and then we returned fire. Basically, we were shooting at the air. It took a minute before you could realize where they were at, but we saw some muzzle flashes, and so then everybody kind of trained their firing on that. But I'm thinking it probably didn't last 10 minutes. We went over and found two snipers that we had shot. So that was my first experience, and it was kind of a rush. I'll never forget going over and looking at the one particular sniper. He had been shot in the head, and I still have flashbacks sometimes of that picture. It was kind of an ugly picture, but up until that point, it was kind of a rush, an adrenaline rush to think, all right, man, I'm finally here. I'm doing this. But then when you walked over and saw the bodies, even though they were enemies, then it kind of hit you that this isn't a movie. This is real life.
Yeah. When did you, and you may have kind of already talked about that, but when did you start to feel like, okay, I'm a veteran, I know what I'm doing, I've been in situations?
I don't know that I ever got to the point that I felt like I know what I'm doing. After a little bit of time, you kind of assume that every day is a different adventure, and it's kind of hard to explain. I guess you never get comfortable with that situation, life and death situations. But after being shot at and returning fire and seeing the results of your guys being killed and their guys being killed, I think you just become a little bit more callous, and it's just like it's like going to work in the factory and punching the clock. You get up in the morning and you go out and you do whatever it is that they call you for you to do, and then you punch out and go to sleep. So I don't know if there was ever a comfort level with it, but you just become accustomed to it, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if that's the answer to the question, but that's a tough question for me.
Did you, looking back at your service, do you see an arc of your own experience and how you changed over time, and does it surprise you when you look back?
Yeah, I became harder and less emotional very quickly, I think, and I think that's still the biggest thing that I take away from it. I have a hard time showing emotion now a lot, Now, sometimes things will hit me and I'll break down and I'll kind of cry. I mean, I can watch a movie on TV where somebody has done something for their friend, and that touches me. You know, it's not so much the death or whatever, but most of the time I'm pretty callous, and my wife will tease me sometimes about, you know, it's okay to smile, you know, and do that kind of stuff. So I guess that's the biggest thing.
And that has stayed with you since Vietnam.
Yeah. I was always pretty happy-go-lucky, and I guess to some point I still have a little bit of that. But there are things that I enjoy. It just I have a hard time showing a lot of emotion, one way or the other, in that.
Sorry, I'm just checking my notes here. You had a few skirmishes and a few firefights leading up to Foxtrot Ridge. Can you walk us through that day and tell us how that was so much different and more extreme than what you'd been through previously?
Okay, yeah, Foxtrot Ridge, the actual battle for Foxtrot Ridge took place 10 days. See, I was wounded on the 15th. It was the 28th was when the actual major battle took place. We were around Foxtrot Ridge, and our job at the time, we had left LZ Hawk, which was about, I don't know, 8 or 10 miles south of Quezon, Son, and we'd gone up the road, and then we were supposed to go down into this ravine and sweep the area to find out that, you know, if there was anything down there. I had heard the platoon commander and the company commander on the radio talking about there had been some movement, or, you know, they thought there was some stuff going on down there, some NVA or VC or something down there. So our job was to go down and sweep through that little ravine and valley just to see what was there. And there again, sometimes you just felt like you're a target. You're just going down there and see if you could draw fire. But as we started down over the road, we went off the road down over this little ravine, and my squad was the point element of the platoon that particular day, and they rotated that around, but we were the point element. And being the radio man, I was about the fourth man back. There was a point man, and then another guy, and then the squad leader, and then I was behind the squad leader. But we kind of went around this boulder, and you could look down into this little valley. It was a beautiful picture, but we actually saw 3 NVA soldiers down there, and they were just standing there talking to each other. They had no idea that we were there. So we knew immediately that there's somebody down there, and they're pretty relaxed, you know, so we assumed that there was probably a decent number of them down there. It wasn't just 2 or 3 guys by themselves. So anyway, we kind of got down, and then they walked out of this little meadow-like thing into the woods that was around it. And so then we started down the edge of this big open meadow and went down over an embankment, and it kept getting steeper and steeper. And we got, I don't know, probably 15 minutes into this after we had spotted them. Our point element kind of went down into it was kind of like a bomb crater. There was bomb damage. There was trees and stuff that had been knocked down, and there was, you know, holes in the ground. But this, I think, was more like a natural ravine. Anyway, Mueller was the point guy, and he excuse me, he walked down into that, and as soon as he started back up out of that, Walsh, who was our squad leader, and myself simultaneously spotted a little bit of movement off to the right. And so Walsh whistled real loud. I'm not much of a whistler, but fortunately he was. And Mueller stopped and turned around, and then he motioned for him to get down. And as soon as he motioned for him to get down, they opened up with all sorts of stuff. And fortunately, there was that cover of this little ravine, and you could see that the muzzle flashes coming from behind these trees and such. But that was one of the times we didn't move into them. we got down, and it's probably a good thing that we did, because at the time we didn't know for sure how many people was there. After the fact, they've estimated a company, or maybe a larger unit than a company, that we actually made contact with. And this was the part of the regiment that was in that area that actually assaulted Foxtrot Ridge on the 28th of May. This was the 15th of May when this happened. So anyway, we went down into there, and Mueller, who was our point guy, he was I used to call him John Wayne. He was the John Wayne type. He was a brave hero, whatever you want to call it. But anyway, he decided that he would try to crawl out of this little ravine and go around the left side and see if he could get behind, or find out exactly how many people or whatever was there. So he said, I carried a 45 and an M16 since I had the radio. And he said, let me have your 45 and I'll take it with my M16. So I tossed my 45 to him, and then he started up around, and as soon as he got out of sight, you could hear him open up on him, and you could kind of hear him groan. So you knew he got hit, and there was so much fire, we didn't really do anything. I mean, you just get back down, and some of the guys were kind of shooting over their head. They'd hold the gun up, the M16 up, and shoot it without getting up and really looking. And so then one of the other guys decided he was going to try to go around the other side and see if he gets in. And the same thing happened to him. He was killed. And then his buddy, they joined on the buddy system, I found out later, knew that his friend had been hit. So he went up to try to pull him back, and then he got killed. And so within the first 10 minutes, we had lost 3 guys. And then the fire just kept coming. We called in on the radio and explained our situation. We were kind of cut off from the rest of the platoon because we were the point element, but we knew where our people were. And they had the 60 millimeter mortars that they were firing, and they had some M60 machine guns that they were firing to cover us, to keep the people down, because we were in a pretty vulnerable situation down there. If the enemy would have decided to come over the hill or over the ridge down into this ravine, there was only 5 or 6 of us down there, and it would have been a pretty quick. We could have been eliminated pretty quickly. Or if they'd have just thrown some Chi-Coms or something, the Chinese grenades down there, they could have done us a lot of damage. But I guess it was the fire from our unit that kept them down. But it was a pretty nerve-wracking experience, because that was one of the few times I felt like I had absolutely no control over what was going on. You really couldn't shoot back, because you couldn't. If you stood up to get a shot, then you were going to get shot. So we were just kind of sitting there, listening to all this stuff going on, and seeing the dirt and stuff fly up around you where bullets were firing, were hitting, and it was a pretty intense situation. At that point, there was about a 30 or 40 second period of time there that all I wanted to do was just get out of there. I mean, if there would have been a little avenue, I think I would have run. I mean, and I still fight with the fact that that's being a coward, and I struggle with that from time to time, because I'm thinking, here it is, the rubber's finally met the road, and I'm a coward because I just wanted out of there. Now, it only lasted 30 or 40 seconds, I guess, and then at that point, you pretty much decided, I'm not going to get out of here, so there's no point in worrying about it. Just sit back and wait for them to come over the top and take as many people out as you can, and that's the end of it, So it was a pretty intense experience, and
Is that the most frightening experience you've ever been through?
Without a doubt, that's the most frightening thing that's ever happened to me. In the other firefights, and I wasn't in a lot of firefights, in the first 3 months that I was there. There was a few, some snipers and stuff like that. There was a couple other ones, but it all happened so fast, and you felt like you could make a contribution, because you could actually get a shot. You could see muzzle flashes, you could fire back. But here, it was like there's nothing we can do. Now, I did feel like I had a little bit of control because of the radio, and I was in constant contact with the platoon commander, and they called in artillery, and I think it was from Whiskey Battery, which was stationed up at Quezon. There was also a battery, a Marine Corps battery at LZ Hawk. So I'm not 100% sure which battery it actually was, or it may have been both of them. I don't know, but I know they fired some rounds in there, and then he got me on the radio and said, "How close is that to your position?" And I talked to Walsh, and we adjusted it a little bit closer. And other than that, I didn't feel like I could make much of a contribution. I did feel better, and I guess I need to explain this part. I have some PTSD, and for a while I was having a lot of dreams and stuff like that. So sometimes the dreams get mixed up with reality, But in my mind, we called in, or the platoon commander or the company commander, I'm not sure which one, actually called in an airstrike. Because I remember somebody telling me on the radio, be sure you stay down. The fast movers will be here in 30 seconds. Which was what they called the Phantoms. I assume that's what it was. That's what most of everything it was. There was those F-4 Phantoms. But I'm 98% sure that that's what happened. But I dream about that. I haven't dreamed about it much here lately, but there for a long time I was dreaming about that a lot. And I think that there was airstrikes called in, but if somebody tells me there wasn't, I couldn't argue with them too much. So.
Between you and your squad leader, Walsh, you were able to, you couldn't return fire. They had fire superiority, but you had the radio. You had your link to the outside world. Did he stay calm? Was that a calming presence and help the rest of the squad get their stuff together?
He was very calm. Walsh was very calm. And even the other guy, there was a couple of guys who were down there who had gotten wounded, but everybody was pretty calm. I don't know what they were feeling. I lost contact with those guys immediately because I was wounded in the medevac out. I never saw them, never got a chance to talk to them or anything, But so I don't know how scared they were, but I like to think that my outside demeanor was reasonably calm. But boy, inside, it was a different thing. So I don't know if they all felt that. But like I said, I still struggle today with the fact that when the rubber hit the road, I did a cowardly thing because I wanted to run. I didn't. There was no place to go. But I'm not so sure if there hadn't been a little space, I might not have just zipped right on out of there because I was totally, I can't describe the fear, But once you looked at Walsh and the other guys, they all seemed so calm. And right when that was going on, the platoon commander hit me on the radio, or he hit us on the radio. I was just the mouthpiece. And I handed the radio, I talked to him and I handed the radio to Walsh. And so that kind of brought me back to reality. And at that point I thought, you're not going to make it out of here, so just make the best of it, do the best you can,
Almost every combat veteran that I've talked to quite a few, I ask them, did you ever feel fear? And invariably they'll say, we all felt fear. It was just a question of your training kicks in and you start doing your job. You have a job to do with platoon leaders and such. I had to protect my men, so I overcame my fear and that kicked in. And it sounds like the same thing happened in your case. You had your moment of fear, and then you mastered it, and you got on with your job.
The job kicked in. The fear never did go away. But when they hit me on the radio, and I had to answer the radio. I knew I had to answer the radio, so I answered the radio, and I talked to the platoon commander for a second, and then he wanted to talk to the squad leader, so I gave it to Walsh, and they talked for, 30 seconds or so, and he handed it back to me, and then we talked adjusting fire, on the mortars and everything like that. And then they came back and said, okay, after these fast movers come in, then we're going to get the other guys down there to try to help you to get you out of there, And but there was there was more going on than just what was in that little space where I was, because the other guys were higher up on the hill or up on the ridge, but they were taking fire because Ron got hit partially down the hill. I think they were trying to come down and relieve us and help us to get our wounded or killed out and get back up the hill. And so that was going on up there too. There was three. I think it was three guys who were killed up on top or somewhere between the bottom and the top. So it was a pretty wide front.
How long would you estimate from the start of the ambush until you were adjusting rounds to relieve some of the pressure on you?
The rounds it was probably 10 minutes, I suppose, until the rounds started hitting. The whole thing, as I sit here and think about it, it seems like it was hours. It was probably 30 minutes, the time that we were actually down there in that position. Within 30 minutes, we had been linked up with the rest of the platoon, and the company was there as well. So I think they sent some reinforcements over and got us and our wounded and killed back up to relative safety. While I was waiting to be medevaced after I gotten back up, after I was shot and got back up on top, they were still taking the RPG rounds and stuff like that, and there was still gunfire going off. But it was I'm guessing probably 30 minutes down there in the hole.
So the fast movers, the Phantoms, come through, and there's some kind of corridor is made to which you are reconnected with the platoon. What were you feeling at that time?
At that time, I was as happy as I was scared, I guess. And I don't know that they actually made a corridor for us to get back up, but what the fast movers did, because they had some napalm, it kept the enemy down. There was still fire going on, but it kept the enemy's heads down to the point that it probably took 5 minutes for us at that point to get down, and some of the other guys came down and helped with the wounded and the killed to get them back up. So it was probably 5 minutes, but during that time, there all I can remember is explosions, because it seemed like the artillery and the Phantoms were working that area over pretty heavy to keep their heads down until we got back up to relative safety.
Were you as yet unwounded when they made contact with you? At what point did you receive your wounds?
Yeah, we were about halfway back up the hill, and there was a wounded guy, and I apologize to my unit because some of these guys I don't remember their names, But anyway, there was two guys carrying a wounded guy, and Walsh and I were kind of moving as the four of us together, and I slipped. And when I slipped, I kind of slid down the hill a little bit, and there was gunfire going off around anyway, but I felt like something had dropped on my foot. I thought a rock or something had dropped from my foot, and I was actually shot in the foot. And so that they had to, some other guys then had to help me get back up the hill. So it was somewhere in the middle, I guess. I seemed like I was reasonably close to the top, because it seemed like just a couple minutes I was up there by the LZ where they were calling in the helicopters to medevac the dead and wounded.
Did you were in considerable pain from the gunshot wound. Were you just focused on that? Was there any kind of, military activity thoughts going through your mind?
Well, I was pretty focused on the pain. It was pretty painful. But I didn't have my 45, but I had my M16, and I was, I wanted to be sure that somebody didn't come up behind us, that I could still protect myself and the other people as we were crawling up there. And I crawled most of the way. There was a guy who helped me because it was a pretty tough terrain. So there was one guy helping me, but I crawled. But I can remember having the M16 up as I was crawling, thinking if I see somebody, I'm going to pop them. So.
When you got to the top and you were in a hasty medical clearing or situation, you didn't see Ron in what was going on at that point.
That's as I was coming back up the hill, and I don't remember if Ron's squad was right behind us or if they were there was another squad between us and them. But I can remember as we were coming back up and guys were helping us, I saw the guys that were in his squad, Smetty and those other guys, but I didn't see him. And at the time I thought, well, I just missed him or whatever. But then I asked one of the guys, I said, where's Whitlock? And they said, well, he got hit. And I said, well, how bad was he hit? And the guy kind of shrugged his shoulders like, I don't know. So when I got back up on top, I was pretty concerned about that because, like I said, we've been friends since we were 5 or 6 years old. But when I got back up there, the corpsman who was working on me, and he was also working on another guy that had been wounded, I asked him, I said, did Whitlock come through here? And he said, yeah. And he just kept working. And I said, well, how bad was he hit? And he said he was killed. And that was harder for me than about anything I'd been through up to that point, I guess, because Ron and I'd been through a lot together. We went camping together as families and stuff like that, and I can remember thinking, how am I going to explain this to his mom and dad, Bob and Irene? How am I going to face them? That was a tough situation for me, and I know they put me on the helicopter, and I was hurting. But I was hurting more inside than I was outside. I think I couldn't get that out of my head that he was gone. And yeah, you got other friends, people that I knew there, Mueller and Diaz and Pagan, those guys that were killed. You felt bad about them, but it was different with Ron because he was part of me. And it was probably a 3 or 4, maybe 5-minute flight up to Quezon to Charlie Med, and it was a long, tough flight for me. There was our gunnery sergeant was killed. He was up on top there. He was killed, and as we were flying up there, the poncho that they had him covered up with kind of blew open, and you could see him, and I could see the hole in his chest, and I can remember that, but still, I couldn't get Ron out of my head, And I was in pretty bad shape when I got there. I was emotionally, I was gone. I was sobbing and crying, and you feel bad about that, but at the time, I had no control over that. It's just what it was. So, and then while I was laying there at Charlie Med waiting for my turn to go into the operating room, I was pretty broke up, and I heard this voice that said, "What's all the racket going on down there?" Or something. I don't remember the exact words, but I recognized it was his voice, and I raised up, and then I saw him down there, and I wanted to get up, but the corpsmen and everything was right there, and they wouldn't let you get up. But I remember saying, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, I got some shrapnel or something." But it was like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. And I hate to say it, but I didn't think about any of the other guys, because we lost 7 guys that day. But man, I did as low as I was half an hour earlier, I was that much higher. It was. I don't know. I don't like to say it's the happiest I've ever been in my life, but up to that point, it was probably the happiest I had ever been in my life. Just to know that he's still breathing.
Do you suppose now, looking back, and we've talked, you said you guard your emotions very carefully, or you don't show emotions. That swing from despair to happiness that you experienced in a half hour, do you think any of that, even 50 years ago, is affecting you now?
I don't know. I still see a counselor once a month or so, and we've talked about that some. He's convinced that it does, that's part of the reason that I guard myself. I'm not as convinced as he is, but who's to say? The thing, Ron and I were both Christian when we went in, and that has played such a huge part of the healing and all that. I don't know. I don't know if that's the reason I'm guarded my emotions or what, but I'm just a much more private person than I ever used to be, I guess. So, like I said, that my counselor at the VA, he says that's probably got a lot to do with it. But
well, you were treated for your wounds on your foot, and that made you combat ineffective.
Yeah, because I was shot right in the top of the foot, and it took a chip out of the bone, and it was a lengthy process to rehab, and I suppose that's why they sent me. They first sent me to Charlie Med there at Quezon, and then they sent me to Fubai, which is where our battalion was. Our base area was in Fubai, which I'm guessing was about 25 miles south and east of Quezon, somewhere in that neighborhood. But anyway, they sent me there, and then I was there for, I don't know, a week or 10 days, something like that. And then they sent me to Yokosuka, Japan, it was an Air Force hospital. I can't remember the name of the hospital, but it was in Yokosuka. And I was there for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they sent me back to the Naval Hospital in Philadelphia. And I was there for a month and a half, 2 months, something like that. And at that point, I was on crutches still. It was September. I was wounded in May. It was September when they transferred me to Camp Lejeune to 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines. So
when you rejoined the Marines after your rehabilitation, what were you doing at that point?
Okay, I did something that my dad told me never to do. They brought me into 3-6. There was about 8 or 10 of us that were joining that battalion at the time, and we were up at the headquarters, and this gunnery sergeant came out, and he said, "Does anybody here know how to type?" Well, I knew how to type. I wasn't a very good typist, but my dad always told me, don't volunteer for anything, because they'll tell you, we want truck drivers, and the next thing you know, you're pushing wheelbarrows or something like that. But at the time, I thought, yeah, I can type. So I said, yes, sir, I can type. So I ended up going to work in the operations office. Started out as a clerk typist and ended up being a training NCO for the battalion. So I had a no combat duty profile, which meant that you couldn't go back into combat as a target, I guess. But I was in that was a combat outfit, So, but the fact I worked in the office, I guess it was okay. And then the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines was chosen to go on the float, they call it, where we went over to the Med. They would rotate battalions in and out of there for security, and it was our turn to go. And in order to go, I had to rescind my combat duty profile. I had to sign off that I was rehabilitated and I'd be okay. So I signed off on that. went over there and went to the Mediterranean. Got to see a lot of the world. It was a pretty neat experience. And then when I got back, I got married, and in my mind I was thinking I can't go back to combat, so it's okay to get married. And the military is no life for a married guy. So after about 6 months or so, I decided, you know what, I'm not going to stay in, because originally I thought I would probably make a career out of it, and I could see what it was doing to, how hard it was on my wife. I mean, she was only 18, I was 20, and it was tough on her. So I thought, well, I'll just get out, and I put in my paperwork, because at the time the Marine Corps was bringing people back from Vietnam, and they didn't have a place to put everybody. So if you had served in combat, you could get out early. So I signed up for the early out, and then it's kind of unique. Not too long after I got the paperwork signed and everything in the process, I got orders from D.C. to go back to Vietnam. So it's. I guess I'm kind of glad that I decided early to get out. It would have been a tough call at the time to think, well, do I take the early out, or do I go back and do my duty? Because I always felt guilty that I only spent 4 months there, 3.5 months there, when everybody else spent 13 months. But the Lord took care of all that. Like I said, I already had the paperwork in the process whenever I got my orders, so that they rescinded the orders and everything was okay.
When you were part of the training unit, what lessons were you able to impart on the young recruits, and did you feel that was helping, you were doing your part also?
Yeah, I felt like that what we were doing was going to save some lives if they got into combat, because the training officer was Lieutenant Woodard, who just out of coincidence was was 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines. He was in Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, same time that I was. Now he got moved up from the platoon commander of my platoon. When I got there, they moved him up to the S2 officer, the intelligence officer of the battalion. So I didn't really know him that well. I knew who he was, but he was actually the training officer of 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines. So he was a sharp guy, and he really, in a lot of the training stuff that he would set up scenarios that you would go out and practice combat situations, he was instrumental in saving a lot of lives. I was the NCO in charge to kind of help move things around, but he was the one who came up with the curriculum and the exercises and stuff like that. So I did feel like that even though it was a regular battalion, that we put them through the paces based on what we had experienced. And there were several people in that office and in the battalion who were veterans. It wasn't that they were all new guys. It was probably, 30% veterans, and the other 70% were newer guys that were just coming out of their infantry training and all that.
So when you were finally separated from the service, when you left the Marines, were you still feeling some anxiety, some guilt, or were you relieved overall?
No, I was feeling quite a bit of anxiety. I felt like I hadn't fulfilled my obligation. I had only spent 3.5 months there in Vietnam, and I was feeling particularly guilty that I went ahead and took the discharge rather than going back, because I did have the opportunity to go back. So I thought there was quite a bit of anxiety, and I still feel some of that today, I think. I know that my counselor says that I have survivor's remorse more than anything else, because it's hard for me to figure out. There was guys who were braver than me, stronger than me, better than me, that were killed doing the same job that I was doing. And so that kind of bothers me. But I was happy to get out, but I was at the other side of the coin. I felt I was safer there than I was going out in the world. I'd had some experiences when I first came back with the civilians, who were a lot of times more vicious than the NVA were. So I felt safer in the service than I did out there. Mm-hmm. What we call, at the time, we called it in the world, being in the world.
You decided you were newlywed, newly married, left the service. What was your kind of plan for yourself, and how did that work out?
Well, originally I had planned to use a GI Bill to, and thought I'd like to teach, and which is kind of unusual because I was a terrible student. I was telling my grandkids and my kids that I graduated high school because they didn't want me to come back again. I wasn't a good student at all, but I really felt like from the work that I had done there in the training battalion or in the training unit, I really felt like I could teach. I had that ability, so that's what I wanted to do. And I came back and went to one of the colleges, local colleges, and interviewed at the admissions department, and they basically told me, we have enough veterans up here. We don't need any more. You guys are. It's going to be hard for you to fit back into society because you're all the atrocities and everything. And they specifically told me that we're not sure that we could justify letting you teach kids, with what you've done. And they didn't really know what I'd done. They just were looking at a piece of paper and said I was a veteran, I guess. I don't know what paperwork they had. But anyway, after that I decided probably academia wasn't the place for me, and I went to work. I originally went to work with my dad doing remodeling work. He was a remodeling contractor, and I worked with him for about a year. And I got hooked up with a ready-mix company. I started driving a truck, and that worked out real well for me. I was with them for 25 years, and I ended up being general manager of the company. So all in all, it's probably good that I didn't end up going to school, I guess. But
the reception had to have stung. Did it motivate you?
Yes, it did motivate. I determined right then and there that I wasn't as bad as people thought, and I was going to prove to them that I could amount to something. Number one, we committed no atrocities. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't atrocities committed in Vietnam. Obviously there were, but the unit I was in was not like that at all. I mean, we were in a position, and we had taken prisoners. We had gone into villages, and we had the opportunity to commit atrocities, but the thought never occurred to us, so we weren't as bad as as a lot of the public was portraying us to be. And I can remember watching movies and TV shows when I first got back, and it seemed like all the bad guys were Vietnam veterans. They had gone off the deep end while they were in Vietnam. So I was bound and determined from that I was going to be a positive, make some kind of positive contribution, And like I said, my faith in God played a lot in that. I wish I could say that I had been a real strong Christian all my whole life, but sometimes I kind of slid off the side. But that's what brought me through. And I think about the guys who, on the 28th of May, after we were wounded, and on the 15th, on the 28th, the actual Battle of Foxtrot Ridge, it was a terrible, terrible situation, and most of the guys that I knew in my platoon were killed at that point. Not all of them, but most of them. And I felt like I had to live and accomplish something for them. They didn't have the opportunity. The one guy, Michael Smith, he was from Mitchell, Indiana, and he was running. The three of us got pretty close, and he was married, and just had a little daughter that he got to hold her, but it really didn't get to know her, and he was killed, and that tore me up. But I kept thinking, I'm gonna make something of myself for them. So it motivated me quite a little bit. You know, I actually named my first son, Mike. I named it after him, after Smitty. So
Does your son know what kind of man he was?
yeah, yeah. For a long time he didn't, and even when we came up with the name Mike, I didn't even go into any great detail with my wife, you know, which is as we were considering names. I said, well, what about Mike? You know, and it happened that the guy who was the best man at our wedding, a friend of mine, his name was Mike. So I think my wife kind of thought, well, you know, it's got to do with him, but it didn't. I wanted Mike because of Smitty, and I don't when my Mike got to be 15, 16 years old, you know, I told him a little bit about the situation. So
Your father was a Marine Corps veteran, Guadalcanal,
Yes.
which was no picnic.
Right.
Were you able to talk with him or any other members of your family about your experiences?
You know, Dad never talked much about his experiences in World War II, and when I came back, we worked together, which was a blessing. And occasionally, you know, we would talk about different things, but we never really talked about circumstances. You know, you talk about different guys you knew, you know, and but I couldn't tell you today exactly what any experience that my dad had, because he never really shared that with me, and I never really told him of any of the experiences that I had. We just talked about the camaraderie. My dad had. I'm not so sure that my dad didn't have a little bit of PTSD too, because he had a friend that was from Pennsylvania. This guy's name was Jim Sisley, and they came to visit us a couple different times. And I can remember we had this big front porch at the house, and I can remember Dad and Jim sitting out there, and sometimes they'd just be looking at the floor. They wouldn't be talking. They'd be talking, then the next thing you know, they're just looking at the floor. So I'm not so sure that some of that stuff, the PTSD, didn't affect them as well. You know, you never know. My dad was the strongest person I've ever known. You know, his big thing was mind over matter. You know, if you get something in your mind and you want to do it, then there's no reason you can't do it. So, but I still wonder. I would have liked to have gone back. I wish they would have pushed the issue to find out a little bit more about that, because I think he was hurting too. It was a little bit different because they were welcomed home, you know, as we weren't. But
we had talked about the effect that Gulf War I and that experience, and how America rallied behind America's soldiers at that time, and many Vietnam veterans welcomed that, or were able to begin talking at that point. You retreated in reaction to it. You retreated backwards. Your journey through PTSD has been longer. So can you talk about what eventually got you to talk and open up about your experiences?
the PTSD, I guess, I've had it for 50 years, I guess. The last 10 years is when I really realized that there was something wrong. I would have fits of anger, and in my management position at the Ready Mix Company, we had 30 drivers and some dump truck drivers and some other people involved, and there's always conflicts that come up, you know. And there were sometimes, boy, I'd want to come to blows with people. I didn't with my own employees, and then I also had to deal with some customers. And we used to say, you know, customers are always right, but they're not always smart. This is what the guys there at the Ready Mix Company. So there was customers that I just wanted to, I'd get into arguments with them, and I could feel my temper getting up. And I can look back now and see that was the PTSD, you know, kicking in, because I was so angry at what happened to us when we came back that I had a hard time getting over that, I guess. So, but when the Gulf War came, I was very proud of the country for embracing these guys as they came home. I made 2 trips out to the airport when guys were coming back, because they would come back as a unit instead of just as an individual. And I went twice. I went out there to kind of wave the flag and welcome them home. But at the same time, I felt a little jealous, and that's a terrible thing to say because I shouldn't feel that way. But I did. I felt a little jealous, thinking, you know, we did the same thing. You know, we defended the innocent, and we did, you know, our service to our country, and we were, you know, pretty much just swept under the rug. You know, so I felt a little jealous, and some of the guys that I was working with, they knew I was a veteran, and they started asking me questions more than what they had in the past, and I just, you know, I just clammed up. I said, you know, it's over and done with. I don't want to talk about it, you know. So it kind of drove me the other way, but it all worked out pretty well in the end, I guess.
You had set the timeline at about within the last 10 years you had started talking. Do you think any of that is maybe some form of kinship with the soldiers returning from Afghanistan and Iraq, and that many of them are experiencing PTSD, and that, you know, these young men are going through problems and maybe they could benefit, or maybe it's somehow allowed you to talk more and more freely?
That has helped me immensely, because when I was first diagnosed with PTSD at the VA, which was about 10 years ago, 8 or 10 years ago, they suggested that I go to up to Michigan, at the VA in Michigan. They have a real good in-house program, and I had gone through some programs here in Indianapolis, but they don't have a long-term care type thing. It's an hour class, and you go through 8 or 9 classes, and then you're done. And this was an in-house program, and they suggested that with some of the anger issues and stuff that I was having, that I should go up there. And I didn't even think about it, but when I got up there, there was I think about 18 people in this group that we lived in a barracks, just like a military barracks, and I was up there for 15 days. There was 2 Vietnam veterans. Everybody else was Gulf War. And that was an eye-opening experience to me. And that's when I really started talking a little bit, because I could talk to these guys, and they befriended me. They took me in like I was one of them, you know, even though I was old enough to be their dad, most of them. And so was the other guy, the Vietnam veteran. And so I guess I wasn't ashamed, you know, that I was having these feelings, because I always felt like it's a weakness, it's a character flaw, that I can't control this. And you can listen to these other guys and realize that it was a different arena. It was in the desert as opposed to the jungle, but they went through the same things. It was the same fear. It was the same deal, and I wasn't quite as wild of an animal as I thought I was, I guess. So that is what really got me started talking. Once I hooked up with some of those guys, and there's, you know, one of the guys in particular that lives up there. Peter Center is his name. He and I are staying in contact on Facebook ever since. And it's been probably 5 or 6 years ago that I went up there, I guess. So it's kind of that was the catalyst, I guess, being hooked up with those guys and realizing that we're all brothers and sisters. There were some ladies up there too.
Is it, you said you were comfortable, you knew that they understood what you were feeling because they had been through it too, and I guess maybe it's something that only a combat veteran, doesn't matter what the era is, can express to another combat veteran. But was it easier with a stranger than maybe your father?
Yeah, because when you started out, you didn't feel like that you had to guard yourself. You know, when I'm talking to somebody that I know, I still have to protect from giving away too much. You know, because I had one experience, and maybe this is not apropos, I don't know, but I had one experience with a guy who was a very, very good friend of mine through work, and he and I were very close for 25 years. We worked there together, and he was always pumping me. What was it like? What was it like? What was it like? And sometimes I just make up stuff, just to get him off my back, And one day we were sitting down for lunch, and he said, I want you to tell me, what was it really like? So I told him a little bit about this, the May the 15th, 1968, the start of Foxtrot Ridge. And it was never the same between us after that. I mean, he was friendly, but there was just a little bit of standoffishness, and that concerned me. So with somebody that I knew, I didn't feel like I could really open up because I didn't want to drive people away. I didn't tell my wife, the kids, anything, because you don't know how people are going to react, But once I got up there with strangers, it was different, and it was so revealing to me that I could talk to them, and it didn't drive them away. It brought us closer together, because they were sharing stuff that had happened to them, and I could relate to it, And here's people that are 30 years younger than me that we could relate to each other, And the way that thing was set up there, you had different classes that you would go to throughout the day, and then about 4:30, you were on your own. They had a theater and golf courses and stuff like that. So these guys would ask me, "Hey, let's go to the movie, or let's go play some golf or something." And while you're out there playing, you're actually talking about some of that stuff, and it becomes natural. It's not something that you have to hide. It's a natural thing that you can. I didn't have to worry about, am I going to scare this guy? Am I going to, are they not going to want to have anything to do with me? So that was a catalyst. I think that's when I realized that I owed it to myself to get this stuff out in the open rather than just keep it all bottled up all the time.
Finishing up near the end here, if you had advice for younger soldiers or veterans who are suffering from PTSD, what would your advice be for them?
It's two things, and I talk to some guys occasionally, that I come in contact with. I still go out to the VA, and when you're sitting there in the waiting room, I tell them, don't underestimate the power of God. Read your Bible and turn it over to God. And then the other thing is, don't hide it. Because you can't hide from yourself, and that's what I did for 40 years. I hid from myself. You gotta get it out. Tell yourself your story. Write it down. That helped me to write it all down and periodically read it. But don't stuff it. Don't try to keep it in there and pretend that you're somebody that you're not, because all that does is it just makes the anger get worse, and the paranoia get worse, and the dreams get worse, and the flashbacks get worse. So you got to get it out.
Let me check and see if any final thoughts as far as anything you'd like future generations to know about you or your service in Vietnam.
Maybe not so much personally what I like for them to know about me, but I would like for them to know about the Vietnam era soldier, that we were not baby killers and just out there to do damage to people. I mean, we were 18, 19, 20 years old. I mean, I celebrated my 19th birthday 2 weeks before I got shot. And we were there to do the right thing. We were there to help the people of Vietnam overcome the communist regime. And you can go back in history, will determine, was that good war or bad war? I don't know. But I just want them to know that we're just people. We're just like everybody else. And we didn't do, the most of us did not go over there and commit any atrocities or do something that I were ashamed of. I'm not ashamed of it. There was 40 years of my life that I didn't want to share it because I was afraid everybody else was ashamed of it, you know. So that's what I'd like for the future generations to remember, that we're just people. We just did a job, and it didn't turn out like I wish it would have turned out, but it wasn't our fault. It wasn't the soldiers' fault.
Well, Gary, on behalf of WIPB and Ball State, thank you for your service to our country, and welcome home.
Well, thank you very much, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to share my story, I guess. I've never done this before, and when Ron first contacted me, I thought, man, I don't know if I can do that or not, but it was not a painful experience at all. I appreciate very much your openness and the opportunity to do this.
Well, thank you, and future generations will see your story and hear your story, and hopefully learn from it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.